increased conflict, and interpersonal violence. Alcohol is the drug most directly linked to violence and is involved in 2/3 of all homicides. In addition, alcohol is a major contributor to traffic accidents, including 40% of fatal crashes. Furthermore, the rising use of methamphetamine and its accompanying violent behavior has devastated many workplace environments. This program will examine the effects of alcohol and other drugs on the user, as well as the consequences to workplace safety. The task of identifying and confronting the possible substance abuser depends on several things: supervision, management's willingness to act, and the willingness of human resource personnel to support these actions. This program will address the articulation and application of reasonable cause for workplace drug testing and provide a framework that allows the supervisor to confidently confront the suspected substance abuser. Let me introduce Patrick Prince. He's a partner with Prince & Phelps Consultants, a corporate training and management consulting firm specializing in workplace violence prevention, conflict resolution, recognition and management of workplace substance abuse, trauma response, and other related occupational health and safety issues. Since 2007, he has served as president of the Los Angeles chapter of the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. He currently serves on the American National Standards Task Force. They work to develop standards and guidelines for workplace violence prevention and intervention. Patrick has been providing reasonable suspicion training for more than 20 years and is certified by the International Association of Chiefs of Police as a drug recognition expert. He is also an instructor with the Los Angeles Police Department's Narcotics School. He's a recognized expert in the articulation and application of reasonable cause for workplace drug testing. And he has trained over 10,000 supervisors in a variety of industries to identify and confront the suspected substance-abusing employee. He's provided training on a regular basis for a number of school districts in the state of California. Our guests in the studio today represent the areas of transportation, human resources, and school administration. Let me introduce you to John Houston, Jill Galdo, Marshall Shimon, and Teresa Franco. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Patrick, let me start. The training has been designed to address substance abuse and drug testing for commercial vehicle operators, and I just want to set that out first. But it sounds like this is an issue that may impact all areas of the campus environment. So let me begin with the big picture, if I might. How significant is drug abuse in this country, and really what is the impact?
Well, there's some extraordinary numbers. We can look at some studies that have been done recently by the Department of Health and Human Services. The numbers are overwhelming. 119 million Americans consider themselves drinkers. Of those, 15.5 million Americans consider themselves to be heavy drinkers. You have to wonder what the folks who consider themselves to be light drinkers drink.
True.
But so we know there's a great deal of alcohol consumption going on. We also know that 32 million people have reported that they have driven drunk in the last year alone. It's overwhelming. It's stunning. We know that at any given time, from 1 out of 50 to maybe sometimes 1 out of 10 drivers on the road is drunk. On our roads today, we know that every day in the state of California, there's 174 people injured or killed in DUI-related traffic accidents. It's a significant issue. In broad terms, it certainly has an impact on transportation. If we look at the other drugs, non-alcohol, 14.6 million Americans consider themselves to be current marijuana users. We know that 2.3 million people have reported using cocaine in the past year. Methamphetamine is over 5.5 million people using methamphetamine. Again, we know that substance abuse is just extraordinary in this country. We even look at the prescription drug use. 4.7 million people perhaps have abused prescription drugs in the last year. Most of those are probably going to be the prescription pain pills.
Mm-hmm. Pat, I hear you using a couple terms that sound very much alike. Substance use and substance abuse. Are they the same?
They're not the same, although the difference might not really be that significant. Typically, we have the broad term substance use. That's any time somebody uses substance. We've broadly defined substance abuse as when that use has a negative impact in their relationships, their professional world, in the quality of their lives. So there really is a significant distinction But that's more an issue for the treatment providers, for the assessors. As a substance abuse professional, one of the mandates is to try to determine to what extent a person has a problem, a substance abuse problem. But really for this training and for us as supervisors and managers, we really are not going to try to determine, is a person using or are they abusing? If it has an impact in the work life, it has an impact in their personal life, we consider it abuse. And that really is significant enough for us.
And Patrick, from where I sit, drug abuse seems to be getting worse. Is that true?
Well, there's two ways of looking at it. Good news and bad news, right? It appears that substance use among certain populations is declining. We look at nationally, we know alcohol sales has declined. The bad news is that it looks like the folks who are using more. And the other piece I think is really distressing for us is that it looks like some of the drugs that are rising in use, especially among the kids, are very, very dramatic. We know there's a huge rise in things like methamphetamine use. We know there's a significant rise in OxyContin, the synthetic opiate. So on one hand, number of users appears to be going down. And I think we can attribute it to programs like this. I think we can attribute it to supervisors and managers holding employees more accountable. We can certainly attribute it to school-based outreach programs and education. So I think we're seeing the reaping the rewards, if you will, of many of the initiatives, but we've got a long way to go.
Can I jump in and just ask a question? And that is that it sounds like you're saying impairment is the key here. That's if you can't function the way you're supposed to be functioning in the workplace environment, that's really the be-all and end-all line that we're looking at.
And I think that will be the thread that we're going to use to tie together the question that John brought up. If somebody comes to work impaired, if they're having a negative impact in the workplace, then we're going to consider it abuse. And we're not going to get into trying to count how many drinks, first time or 50th time. We're going to try to minimize that impact in the workplace and take proactive steps to keep this place safe and healthy.
You gave us some striking numbers about the prevalence of drug and alcohol use. What would you say the impact is on the workplace?
Well, if you look at the numbers, we can probably assume that any given workplace has an alcoholism or excessive drinking rate among its employees somewhere between 10 and 20%. We can reasonably assume that you have an illicit drug use anywhere from 5 to 7%, and in some industries much higher. So we have to assume anywhere around 15 to 20% of any given work group has a significant substance use problem. We also know there's some other numbers that are extraordinary. We know that National Safety Council, for example, has suggested that alcohol is directly related to 40% of all occupational accidents and probably 20% of all fatal events in the workplace. It has a huge impact every day in the workplace.
So taking all of this into account then, this raises a really big question. What's an employer supposed to do about that impact of substance abuse on the job?
Well, there's some dramatic legal obligations. If we can go back and look at the OSHA mandates from the 1970s, we know in the general duty clause that OSHA sets forth for all employers that you must provide a work environment free from identifiable health and safety hazards. This becomes significant when we look at folks like the National Institute for Drug Abuse says that substance abuse is the #1 preventable health and safety hazard in the workplace. We need to take steps. So this is general mandate from OSHA. We know in again, broader terms, this concept of respond yet superior. Literally, it means let the master answer. But what it really means is that the employer will be held responsible for the actions or the conduct of its employees if they are acting within the employment contract, which basically means if they're on your clock, you're responsible for their conduct. This goes so far as you're liable for injuries that they may engage in or cause while they're on the clock performing duty for your company.
Now, Pat, can a supervisor be held responsible if an employee is found to be under the influence after an accident?
Well, in many, probably most cases, if an employee is on the job and they engage in behavior which causes an accident or involve an accident, we find supervisors can not only be held responsible, many times can be held liable. Much of this falls under the concept of negligence. And that really is that broad issue that says if you as a supervisor or an employer knew or should have known that there was a problem and you failed to take reasonable and customary or reasonable and prudent, we talk about standard of care. If you as a supervisor failed to take actions, you can be held responsible, maybe even individually, not just organizationally. It really falls under the notion of negligent supervision. Do you know what your employees are doing? Do you know how they're conducting themselves? Do you know if they're able to function and perform in a safe and appropriate manner? And if they're not, and you should have known, or you have other information that told you you did know, then you can be held liable for that.
Thank you.
Now, what if the information is anonymous? What is a supervisor expected to do if they get an anonymous complaint that their employee is a drug abuser?
Well, that's one of the real gray areas that we have to struggle with. It reminds me of the mandate that's put forth to employers when we deal with things like harassment, discrimination. From my perspective, and I think the courts certainly have supported this, once you know, you know. You have to demonstrate that when you became aware that there was a potential problem, that you took, again, reasonable steps to address it. It doesn't necessarily mean we can take administrative action. I don't know that we have enough basis for that, and we can't, through human resources, take action without having a foundation of fact. But at the very least, as an employer, you can go and investigate. You can monitor people's behavior. You can go back and look at a number of indicators which would give information whether they actually had a problem or didn't have a problem. The real issue is under negligent retention, I guess really is where this would fall. Once you became aware of a problem, did you take appropriate steps to resolve it, or did you unlawfully and inappropriately retain that employee? So we look at anonymous reports as really as we would harassment complaints. Because once you know, and then it will be incumbent upon the employer, as represented typically by supervision and management, to demonstrate they took proactive, investigative, responsible steps to address the problem.
Okay.
So, Patrick, given the impact of substance abuse in the workplace, what can an employer do to help live up to, I guess, would be the legal expectations of providing a drug-free workplace?
Well, there really are four major steps that employers need to take. First, they need to develop policies. They need to have policies that articulate the expectations. They outline specifically what are the prohibitions. They let employees, all employees, know what's expected of them. They need to have procedures in place to enforce these policies, administrative guidelines, procedures for addressing the employee administratively as well as on the site. They need to have information available to supervisors so they can do something with a situation when they identify it. And clearly the third issue is you have to have training. People need to have information. They need to know the policy. They need to know the procedures. They need to understand more about the issues at hand. And then the fourth really is drug testing. Testing is a valuable tool that helps supervisors create and maintain this drug-free work environment.
Now, Patrick, can a person test positive for drugs if they eat poppy seed muffins?
Well, we hear a lot of things out there. I think it's important to understand the drug testing process. First of all, the answer is it depends. We know that when somebody provides a sample, that they take the sample of urine. Generally what's going to happen, not generally, what will happen is they're going to split off a certain amount in front of the employee. They'll call that the split sample. The employee will sign off and it's kept in a separate location. Of the remaining sample, they're going to do an initial test. It's called an immunoassay. It's a very broad test. And in fact, we know that on that first test, people can test positive for poppy seed muffins. They can test positive for amphetamines using certain antihistamines. We know certain other substances may test positive for marijuana. So on that initial screen, it's just a broad test. If it's positive on that, they'll continue to work with it. If it's negative, we're done. If it's positive, and it may in fact have a false positive, then some of the remaining sera is subjected to a follow-up test, a confirmation test, and it's very specific to the drug. It's very, very accurate. The courts have been very clear. If they're positive on the first test and positive on the second test, they have that drug on board. But there are still some other issues. Maybe there's a legal reason for that. We can go back and look, and the truth is there are legal medicinal purposes or used for things like cocaine. We know there's a medicinal purpose, marijuana, huge issue in our state. We know there are amphetamine uses in the medical community. We know there may be a legitimate medical reason for the drug being on board. So let's go back to the test. Positive on the first test, positive on the second, then the results will be forwarded to an MRO, the medical review officer, who will contact the employee to get information about medical treatment the employee may be receiving, which might give an explanation to the identified test results. If it turns out that the employee is not taking a legitimate, appropriately prescribed substance, which resulted in the positive test, we'll consider it positive on the first, positive on the follow-up, and then the MRO will consider it to be a confirmed positive. Then the employee is in difficulty. Then they are positive.
So, Patrick, I have a group of drivers that are serious music fans. If they went to a venue and they were exposed to secondhand smoke, could they test positive for drugs?
You know, that comes up over and over again. The research is pretty straightforward that in the normal exposure to secondhand smoke, a person will not be at such a level that they will test positive or be impaired. Having said that, there are times when people will be exposed to substances. I went to a concert. The person next to me started smoking marijuana, and I remember saying, you know, given what I do for a living and I was with my family, would you mind moving? If that person hadn't have moved, I'm going to move. It's not worth me putting my family or my exposure at risk. But getting back to the heart of your question, the courts have again been very clear, and in fact in the Department of Transportation regulations, they specifically preclude the medical review officer from considering secondhand smoke as a causal source of that positive test. So the truth is, a secondhand smoke will not cause a positive test, is not an acceptable defense.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Patrick, we've talked about employers maintaining a drug-free workplace, but when can an employer require that an employee go through a drug test?
Well, Jim, there are really 6 opportunities for a district to drug test someone, although most districts only use 4 of them. The first would be the pre-employment drug test, which really is a post-offer pre-employment because there has to be a relationship between the district and the employee in order to order them. But pre-employment would be one opportunity. Another would be post-accident, that there has been some sort of injurious situation that would allow the district or organization to require somebody to be tested. The third one, which gets a lot of press nowadays, is random testing, when a random number generator perhaps kicks up their name and they're tested on a random basis. The fourth one the districts are more likely to use is going to be on the basis of reasonable suspicion for cause. Now there's 2 other opportunities, and we can see those in the district. One is called return to duty. Once an employee is tested positive, they have to test clean again before they can come back to the job, the return to duty test. And the other is what we call the unannounced follow-up testing. Once an employee has been tested positive, if they're going to maintain their employment with the district, then the district will have the opportunity to test them on an unannounced basis for a number of years. So those are the 4 major types.
Now, it strikes me you've got a wide spectrum of things going on there. Are there strengths and limitations to each of these opportunities?
Yes, there are. When we go back and look at each, everything has a strength and every test has a limitation. For example, pre-employment. One of the great strengths of pre-employment is there's some selection issues. If somebody is testing positive when they're applying for a job with your district, you need to reasonably assume they're going to keep using a drug after they get the job. So we want to non-select them, if you will. There's a lot of folks who need jobs out there. I think one of the weaknesses or limitations to pre-employment drug testing, though, is often we give people several days' notice. There are all kinds of websites out there. There are ways to change your body, to alter your chemistry, if you will, so that you can beat the drug test if you give somebody enough time. So when we look at it, there are strengths and limitations to pre-employment. If you look at the data out there, I still think that nationally, if you look at some of the research, we're running right around 4.5% positive on pre-employment drug testing, which, given all the opportunities to beat the test, you should non-select them because they're not very bright. Mm-hmm. But there's some issues as it relates to pre-employment. The second one would be post-accident. One of the great strengths of post-accident is it lets us know what happened. Most of us have been involved in a safety investigation or an accident investigation. We want to know everything which could have been related to whether it caused or connected to the accident. We want to know the weather. We want to know what time of day. We want to know who was there. We want to know about the vehicles. We want to know what was inside the folks involved. So I think post-accident is a huge opportunity for the organization to know what was going on. Now later on we can argue about whether or not it was causal, but certainly it was connected to and related to the accident. A limitation of post-accident, there's 2, maybe 3. One of the easy ones is that by definition it's too late, and that's a great weakness. The accident's already occurred, and that's not in any of our best interest. Another issue with post-accident testing is that we often don't see organizations consistently apply the rule. For example, if we were to walk out of here and as we left, let's say that John slips and falls and he sprains his ankle. But I'm thinking, that's just old John. He's kind of goofy sometimes. So we're going to get him all fixed up and we let him go home tonight. Tomorrow we come here to do some more work, same place. Marshall slips and falls. But I'm drug testing him. I mean, I bet you had a ponytail when you were a kid. You're a hippie, right? So, but at some level, I trust him. And now we may be exposed to what? What might his complaint be? Well, differential treatment. Maybe discrimination. That's a whole other issue. But we may look at that. Where organizations don't consistently articulate what an accident is and then don't consistently apply the policy, they really are leaving themselves vulnerable to action. So I think that's a great weakness. How do we define it? Now, the Department of Transportation has tried to address that in the regulations by defining under which circumstances you will test post-accident. And the three broad criteria are, number one, when there's a fatal accident. When there's a fatality, you need to test everybody. That is a huge issue for the organization, long-term impact. We need to test when there are injuries requiring medical treatment away from the scene. If they're taken out by an ambulance, they're thrown in the supervisor's vehicle and taken to the clinic, their family comes and takes them up and says they're going to take them. So that would be another opportunity. The third would be when there is damage to the vehicle, disabling it. We often define disabling as requiring to be towed from the scene or some of those ways of doing it. On the other hand, within the regulations, it goes on to say that you will drug test under these circumstances unless you as a supervisor or manager can completely discount the operator as having contributed to the accident. So even under post-accident, we may not test. So I think of the opportunities, post-accident really has some of the greatest limitations. We'll talk in a few minutes, I think, about how we really absorb post-accident into another opportunity. But we have pre-employment, we have post-accident, we have random. And random is getting a lot of attention. It's got a lot of press. People are very upset about it, but it seems to offer some strengths.
Pat, I have a question. Why shouldn't we just test everybody randomly? Wouldn't that catch the drug user?
Well, that certainly has been offered by a lot of people. We need to understand, again, the strengths and limitations. One of the strengths to random is that you don't know it's coming. Your name is kicked up by a random number generator. You have no influence on it. You don't have the opportunity to prepare yourself as you might on the pre-employment.
Sure.
One of the negative aspects, if you will, or limitations to random is that it's random. And statistically, if we go back and look at it, even when we use a number that we use in the educational arena and transportation, a 50% testing rate, it doesn't mean we test half of our employees per year. It means we test a number equivalent to half of our employees per year. What we really find is that, depending on the number of employees in the pool, the larger the number, the smaller the chance of somebody being chosen. If you select on a weekly basis, then typically the chances of an individual's name being selected are anywhere from 5%, maybe down to 1%. And statistics being what it is, it's back to poor Marshall here. So I've been wanting to test him for a while. This week his name doesn't come up. Next week his name doesn't come up. He can go 45 weeks without his name being drawn, and it's still a very low 1 to 5% chance that on that given draw his name will come up. So on one hand, random sounds very positive and forceful. The truth is, it's a very low rate of identifying that person. And I think the other major issue is that some folks have said, and they've argued, I think quite convincingly, that random testing is an invasion of privacy. You come to work, you do a good job, you haven't done anything wrong, and now we go and have you submit to a drug test. Some folks say it's invasive, and I think they make a compelling argument. Now, some other folks have made what I think is an equally compelling argument, maybe more so, that given the nature of some people's work, that their potential impact on public safety outweighs their right to privacy. And we certainly see random testing being applied in 4 major areas. If you work in a nuclear regulatory governed environment, you're going to be randomly tested. If you work in the U.S. military, you're going to be randomly tested. If you have police officer status in this country, you can be randomly tested. And if you have a position that's covered by the Department of Transportation, you are eligible to random testing because your potential impact on public safety outweighs your right to privacy. So back to your question. If we started randomly testing everybody, I think we would not be able to get court acceptance. We would have to demonstrate that their impact on safety outweighs the right to privacy, and we know we can do it in certain areas. I just don't think it'll happen. So because of the statistical aspect of it and because of the invasion of privacy issues, I just don't see it happening. What I really see happening, though, is hopefully expanding this notion of testing for reasonable cause or reasonable suspicion. Somebody once told me those terms are different. I'll be honest with you, I don't know the difference, so I use them interchangeably. Reasonable cause allows a supervisor to take action based on their observations right here, right now. We don't have to wait till an employee's been in an accident. We don't have to wait till their name gets kicked out by a number generator. If the supervisor has a reasonable basis to believe that they may be impaired, they can get them tested at that point in time. That makes a great deal of sense to me.
But then how do you deal with someone who says for cause is subjective? How do you give them an answer to say, is it reliable?
Well, there's two different questions you ask. Is it reliable or is it subjective? And the answer to the subjective part is everything's subjective. I believe what it calls for is supervisory judgment. It calls for the ability and willingness of a supervisor to articulate their expectations, to observe the employee's behavior, to capture violations, and then to be willing to move forward. I think that's a huge piece. That it's subjective does not bother me. Reliable has more to do with, would a supervisor be consistent? If this employee acts in a certain way and this employee acts in a similar way, will I test both of them? And my answer, as we went back to post-accident, is I hope we're consistent. I hope we're reliable as an organization to hold people to these standards. So I'm not offended. I don't think it's a significant argument, though, to say it's subjective, because I accept that it's subjective, but it relies on good supervisory practices, and I think that's reasonable.
Now, Pat, let's say a supervisor requires an employee to get tested for cause. What if that supervisor is wrong?
Well, it depends on how you define the term wrong. If what you're suggesting is that the test came back negative, I'm okay with that. One of the great challenges we have is that we're very, very fearful that if somebody gets tested and it's tested negative, somehow we violated them. And I don't see that to be the case. There was a study done not too long ago by a trade association, manufacturing association, and they polled their members, and they found that when they engaged in for-cause testing, they had a positive test 62% of the time, which means 38% it came back negative. And I was on this panel, and this individual saying, see, that just shows how it's an invasion of privacy. It's subjective. It's gross. It's unfair. I got to speak next, and I said 38% negative? That's okay with me. If we wait till our supervisors are 100% sure it's positive for drugs, it's too late, because we all know that there are a lot of things which can cause impairment besides drugs. Drug testing is just a tool. It's not adverse action. It's not punishment. It's a tool to help the employer, to help the district understand what is giving rise to the supervisor's observations. And if it's a negative test, we go one course of action. If it's a positive test, we go another. That's the role of testing. And so from my perspective, you can't be wrong. It can be something other than drugs, but your supervisor's ability to, getting back to what you mentioned, identify, be articulate, to hold people accountable, that's what we're looking for. And I'm okay with a negative test.
That makes sense.
All right, Patrick, we've talked about management tools for creating a safe, drug-free workplace, but and you've talked a little bit about strengths and limitations of each of the ways to look at this. But let me go back to the basics for just a moment. How would you, we've talked around drugs, how would you define a drug?
Well, I've got a very broad definition of a drug. It isn't really one consistent with, say, medical dictionaries, but the way I define drug, and the way I think we need to define drug in the workplace, is any substance taken into the body that impairs. What we want to do is focus on whether or not an employee is impaired. I guess at a fundamental level, if it doesn't impair, we don't care. We don't really have an issue in our work environments trying to ascertain whether or not an employee is taking 5,000 units of penicillin every day. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, wouldn't share your eating utensils with me. But at a fundamental level, that's really not an issue to us. On the other hand, if they're impaired, then it is something significant. And we don't really care if it's legal or illegal, prescribed or over-the-counter, intentional or unintentional. We care whether they're impaired or not.
So I guess that's a follow-up question. How would you, we've talked about what you consider drug to be, how would you define impairment then?
Again, I've got a fairly broad definition for that. In my opinion, and I've really taken this from a lot of reading I've done and from a number of resources, impairment is that inability for an employee to function in a manner that's safe, effective, or appropriate. If somebody in your workplace is not functioning in a manner that's safe, effective, or appropriate, we have a problem. We have to address it. Now, at some level, we need to look at drug testing then as just an informational tool to help us understand what drug might be causing this. The other piece of that is that, from my perspective, this takes it out of the drug recognition expert's perspective. I'm a drug recognition expert. I can estimate blood alcohol level based on the movement of your eyes. But when it's all said and done, I don't know how to do what y'all do for a living. I don't know how to do all those different functions in a school district. But I do know that supervisors and managers within the district know what's safe. They know what's effective. They know what's appropriate. And what we really want to do is take this whole thing of reasonable cause and take it out of my world and place it into the supervisor's world. This is something that they are not only expert in, but they are competent to identify and articulate. That's what we want to do.
Now, Patrick, aren't there other things that could cause a person to be impaired besides drugs?
Like, what do you think?
Maybe cold medicine?
Fatigue.
Fatigue.
Injury?
Psychological.
Injury, psychological. Well, the truth is, there are a lot of things which could cause impairment. We could go down the list: medical, psychological. Here's the easy question. I don't know if any of you all have been arrested for DUI.
No.
No, okay.
No.
I will ask later. That's right.
We can all say
That's
no.
right. But you know, but you've all watched TV, and typically police officers are trained to ask a number of questions. But one of the key questions that police officers now are trained to ask throughout the state of California is they are asking, when did you last eat? Why would a police officer be interested in when somebody ate? What do you think?
Diabetic.
Diabetes.
Blood
That
sugar
is
levels.
the diabetes question. Some folks say, well, it's absorption of alcohol and some of those issues, which are relevant. But when did you last eat is the diabetes question, because we do see folks arrested regularly for driving under the influence. And you don't have to be diabetic to understand exactly as you say: low blood sugar, slurred speech, poor balance and coordination, problems processing information, belligerent when confronted. Sounds like drugs. So at some level, medical makes sense. If somebody's clinically depressed, and the American Psychological Association once said that 40% of the adult population is depressed sometime, the other 60% too depressed to know it maybe, but I mean, it's a very common issue. There's psychological conditions. It just makes sense to us. Fatigue. There's great research out there on shift work, and that's not under of today's, but looking at the body's rhythms. There, in fact, is some research suggesting that the drowsy driver may be more impactful on American highway than even the drunk driver. So we've got naturally occurring conditions, medical, psychological. We can have equipment failure. There are a lot of issues. So when we start looking at impairment, I'm not going to suggest drugs are the only cause, but I will suggest then drug testing is a tool to help us start to narrow it down. Now, one thing folks have said, though, is, well, why don't we just do the medical evaluation first? Forget the cost part of it. What we do know that is typically, and it's really not a slam on our healthcare system, it's just a truth, that most physicians, most psychologists for that matter, are not trained to look for the presence of substances. That's not part of their training, it's not their expertise. We know they may have a couple of hours every 2 years for the continuing education. But if we have a positive test, it gives us some very powerful information about where to move. If we have a negative test, it allows us to go in a different direction. If we don't have a test, it may never be looked at all. So I completely agree. Impairment is the key. Drugs are a potential source, but not the only source. It's the employer's mandate now to find out what is causing the supervisor's observed impairment, or the employee's impairment as observed by the supervisor, and that's what drug testing helps us do.
Now, earlier you mentioned a person couldn't be impaired from secondhand smoke. If that is true, how does somebody unintentionally become impaired?
We see it in a number of ways. The easiest way, of course, is a big issue with our kids, is slipping somebody a Mickey. It's a big problem in our after-school issues. It's a problem in our club scene where somebody's putting something into their drink, where they're adulterating their food. So that is an issue. We often find another way we can unintentionally impair due to a drug is when we go get prescribed drugs. There's research out there saying 75% of the time somebody sees a doctor, they walk out with a prescription for something, and then we have the additive effect, unexpected side effects. So there's another potential way they become unintentionally impaired. But maybe most common, and we've all had this experience, we're out pumping gas in the middle of August, it's 115 degrees, and we're going, oh my God, the fumes. Well, let's try super unleaded. But we can be overcome by fumes. And look throughout our campuses. We've got cleaning agents. We've got stripping agents. We've got all kinds of substances in our home, for that matter, which may unintentionally impair somebody. The issue for us is that I don't want the supervisor to try to figure out, is this intentional or unintentional, legal, illegal, prescribed, over the counter. I want the supervisor to articulate whether or not the employee was impaired and let testing give us some information about what might be the source of that. and let's say it's unintentional, that's a human resources issue. I think we're going to treat somebody very differently administratively who is overcome by fumes than somebody, say, who's smoking marijuana in the back of the bus. But I don't know that that's a supervisor's strength. That is really our administrative strength, and that's why we want to use drug testing to help guide us where to go. Let's rely on a supervisor's strength. Safe, effective, and appropriate.
Now, Pat, a lot of drugs are legal to take. Wouldn't a supervisor likely be reprimanded or get in trouble? Say they find out this person is actually taking prescription drugs and not illegal drugs.
I think we have supervisors who are very concerned about that, and we have some folks that are probably going to be angry if they get tested. But if we go back to the basis that we've already been putting on the table, if they're impaired, it's a supervisory issue. Now, we know then that your labor relations units will discuss it with the union. You can look at an interactive process with the treating physician. There are opportunities, but to allow somebody to function in our workplace impaired is not acceptable. Again, administratively, we may do different things, but again, I don't want the supervisor being the one to focus on that. Let's look at whether they're impaired or not, utilize the tools to find out the source, and then we can get into the interactive process. Then we'll find out. But I don't think there's causative action if it's prescribed. I think it's more of a liability issue if they don't take action than if they do.
I can understand that. Thanks.
You're welcome.
We've been talking about some fairly broad concepts on defining drugs and talking about the issue of impairment. But if an employer has an employee drug tested, what specifically will they be looking for?
Well, what we're going to see under the Department of Transportation panel, they're going to test for 6 drugs: alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, opiates, and PCP.
Pat, what's the most commonly used drug in the United States?
Well, no matter what definition of drug we use, the most commonly used drug has to be alcohol. If we look at the number of folks I mentioned earlier, 114 million Americans consider themselves to be drinkers. That is significant. Alcohol is by far and away the most widely used drug in the world.
Now, we talked about alcohol a little bit earlier on, and when people generally think about alcohol and whether or not they are drunk or not drunk, we're talking about levels. What do the levels mean, and what are we talking about?
There's a couple of, maybe 3 levels that are significant. We have what we call the presumptive level of intoxication in the state of California. Under the California Motor Vehicle Code, if an individual is operating a vehicle at a 0.08% or higher, they are presumed to be intoxicated, unable to safely operate a motor vehicle. That's a basic DUI level. On the other hand, especially for the transportation folks, we know that there is the 0.04 level, that you cannot legally operate a commercial vehicle with a blood alcohol level of 0.04 or higher. You are at that level presumed impaired, unable to safely operate the commercial vehicle. And then again, we have in many of our districts what we call zero tolerance. And actually we have a legally defined zero tolerance, and that typically applies to people who had prior arrests for drug-related or alcohol-related offenses, or children under certain ages, typically under the age of 21, in alcohol-related offenses. So we have 3 different levels that are relevant: 08, 04, and 01. And each mean different things. What we do is we go back and look at where the research came from. And one of the concerns people have is the progression of impact. And I think what we're starting to look at is this term impairment really does acknowledge that impairment in the inability to perform the job safely, effectively, appropriately really has been identified as beginning by an 04 across the board for studies in most research. When, again, we tie alcohol to things like impairment, we look at the progression of impact, if you will. When people start to use alcohol, there's a very predictable progression of impact. I mean, the first thing that happens physiologically when somebody drinks is it's going to cause that relaxation response. That's why folks will say, boy, what a long day, I need a drink. Well, it does actually dilate certain blood vessels. It does cause that muscular response, and we do relax. At very low levels, again, in many cases as low as an O2, we'll start to see a reduction of inhibition. People start acting out and saying and doing things they might not otherwise do. And we'll start to see that at very low levels. Again, we'll start to see things like a reduction of judgment, which is probably why people are willing to dance with you, when they see how you dance, because your inhibitions are lowered. And again, by an 04, and the research is very extensive on this, we're going to see, even independent of tolerance and other issues like that by an 04, most people are going to demonstrate an impact on their reaction time. And as alcohol continues to increase, we'll see other issues, speech, vision, memory. Typically, though, we have a rule we use that the first things you learn are the last things you lose. Most children, by the time they're 8 months, 12 months of age, are able to walk. It's one of the first things that they're able to learn. If you're starting to see an impact in somebody's ability to walk a line or touch their nose, that gait ataxia, that impaired walking, then you have to presume that they already have had significant impairment on those other areas that are essential: judgment, reaction time, inhibitions. And let me just talk about inhibitions for a minute, because I think we get a lot of evidence or information about inhibitions and we don't really know what we have. If we think about it, everybody here has been to a party, and if you get there late, what are people doing? If they're drinking, what are people doing at parties?
They're loud, they're acting silly.
Right. They're loud, they're laughing at stuff that's not funny, they're hanging on each other, they're repeating themselves, they're doing things that, and you look and thinking, what a bunch of losers. You better hurry and catch up. But at a fundamental level, they're saying things they know they shouldn't, they otherwise wouldn't. We can see a lack of inhibition in the workplace if you think about our experience. People say things that they normally wouldn't. They engage in behavior that they know they shouldn't. You'll see them touching, loud, aggressive. We'll start to see those kind of things. You know, actually, again, to the transportation people, what we see in transportation is they fail to follow established safety protocols. They jump the red light. They go through the yellow. They engage in behavior that otherwise they probably would not engage in. In other areas of the campus, we'll see not using their safety equipment, their PPEs. We'll start to see that behavior where when you come in afterwards and observe it, you've got to scratch your head and ask, what were they thinking? Because they know better. And we have to ask ourselves if those kind of judgment issues, the lack of inhibition, the reaction, those aren't essential. And that becomes important because often when we talk about the impaired employee, what we typically like to think about is the 08, the 10, the fall down drunk. They find themselves, they identify themselves as supervision. What I think we really need to become more just sensitive to is that it's the early levels of impairment that may be in the long run more dramatic. Judgment, reaction time, inhibitions, safe, effective, appropriate. They really do work well together.
So Patrick, how many drinks does it take to get to that significant level of 0.08?
Well, obviously it depends. And it depends on a number of factors. Of course, the most significant being weight. We know that 0.08% is a proportion of your blood that is displaced by alcohol. The more blood you have, the more alcohol it takes to get there. So first and foremost is weight. The second most important issue, it really is gender. And we've all heard the stories that women don't need to drink as much as men, and it is true. A 140-pound female typically need only drink about 80% what a 140-pound male would drink to get to the same blood alcohol level. So what does it take to get to an 08? It depends on size. So if we look at the studies, and DMV has charts, there's a number of opportunities to see those. They say the average man weighs about 190. I haven't weighed 190 in decades, but if we look at that, we know for the average 190-pound male, it takes approximately 3 drinks in an hour. Now, some people are thinking that's a lot, or maybe for some it's a cutback, I'm not really sure, but 3 drinks an hour. Actually, I got a question for you. We've heard the expression, a drink is a drink is a drink. Is it true? What do you think?
I think there are lots of different kinds of drinks.
So as we look at alcohol concentration, a drink's a drink's a drink. We got a couple yes, a couple I'm not sure. Right. Well, we can go back and look at it. What's the most common alcoholic beverage in the world?
Beer.
Beer. We know beer is the most common alcohol. The average alcohol concentration of beer typically is going to be right around 5%. Some a little higher, the darker the beer, some a little lower, but typically we're going to see right around 5%. So you get your 12-ounce can of beer, 5% blood or alcohol concentration, and it turns out to be about 0.6 of 1 ounce of alcohol per beer. On the other hand, you can drink wine. You get your 5-ounce glass of wine. The average alcohol concentration of wine is typically right around 12%. Some a little bit higher, some a little bit lower, but 12% times 5 ounces still gives you 0.6 of 1 ounce of straight alcohol. Or we can look at a shot of hard liquor, distilled spirits. The average alcohol concentration of distilled spirits is 40%, 80 proof, 40%. And again, they vary, but that's pretty much the average. 40% times 1.5 ounces, your standard shot size, gives you 0.6 of 1 ounce of straight alcohol. So how many drinks does it take? It depends on your size. It depends on whether you're drinking standard drinks or not. We've all gone to the restaurant where you can get beer. You can get beer. You can get margaritas.
Sure. Or you can get margaritas.
With
chasers.
That's right, a little float something on top. So again, there are a number of variables that come to play here. But I think the real essence is that typically for the average person, approximately 3 drinks an hour. But it doesn't stay 3 drinks an hour, because some folks would think 3 drinks this hour, 3 drinks next hour, life's good. But we know that as soon as you put alcohol in, it starts to burn off. And so what we end up doing is we start to burn off alcohol, and we burn off approximately 0.015% per hour, or more functional. It takes us 2 hours to burn off or metabolize 1 drink. What that will do is it'll translate that 3 drinks an hour into about 4 or 5 drinks in 3 hours. And whereas, 3 drinks an hour sounds like a lot, 4 or 5, I bet most people have done that. Now, a lot of people choose to no longer drink, but 4 or 5 drinks in 3 hours, we see that. And if that's to get to 0.8. And if what's really important is not an 0.8, but maybe some of these other levels, back to your question, it probably doesn't take very many drinks over an extended period of time to get to a significant blood alcohol level.
Now, Pat, say somebody goes home, they have a few drinks in the evening. Why would that be any of the employers or supervisors' business? Say somebody had a few drinks at home.
It's a tough issue we're challenged with. Part of me wants to say it is none of your business. On the other hand, it depends how many they had. It depends how long it took them to burn it off. And it may become a very important issue. That an employee drinks at home is none of the district's business. If the employee comes to work impaired the next day, it is essential that we identify it. It is imperative that we address it. And so part of what we have to do is understand and communicate and train our employees to understand what is the burn-off rate. Give them the opportunity to be responsible in their drinking. For example, I mentioned it takes about 2 hours to burn off 1 drink. Another way of looking at that is it burns off about 0.015% per hour. Most law enforcement agencies will use an 0.15, or in many cases, some, for example, Highway Patrol will often use a 0.02. That becomes very important because let's say somebody gets up to significant blood alcohol level at home. It's going to burn off in linear fashion. And what that means is that they burn off 0.15 this hour, 0.15 the next hour, 0.15 the next, until it's all gone. So if somebody goes home and drinks and they have more than 2 hours per drink before they come to work, then I'm okay with that. If somebody goes home and drinks and they have less than 2 hours per drink, it becomes an issue for us. I worked a case, I consulted with a school district where they actually had a bus driver was removed from the bus to go provide a random drug sample. And in that particular case, it was a female. She was asked to also provide breath for the alcohol test. At 10:15 in the morning, she tested at approximately 0.032. Below the 0.4, above the 0.1, way below the 0.8. She was dismissed from her employment. As she appealed it, I was asked if I'd be willing to testify that at an 0.32 that she was still impaired. And I truly felt we could make a compelling argument to that end. We could talk about judgment, reaction time. We could really put that on the table. But a much easier position for the school district was something else. What do you think I recommend the district do?
Measure what she was when she came to work.
Let's go see what she was when she came in that morning. Now, she came in at 6 in the morning. The math was a little hard for me, so I made it 6:15 just to make it easier. 6:15 to 10:15 is 4 hours. In my opinion, if we use a 0.015% as the average burn-off, she burned off approximately 0.6. If you add that back on, that means she came to work at an 0.9. Now, if we used an 0.2, which has been accepted in the courts, that would have put her up closer to 0.11. Now, the good news in her particular case was that we were trying to estimate her burn-off. We knew what her burn-off was because if you submit to an alcohol test, you are above the threshold, above an 0.2, then they will void the test. They'll hold on to the individual. They'll submit to another test. We had 2 points in time. We had 2 alcohol levels. Her burn-off was closer to an 0.17. In my opinion, whether you use the early estimate that I had, use a higher one than 0.2, she came into work above an 09. Now, her attorney about jumped out of her shoes and said, my client did not come to work drunk. And I remember responding that that's okay with me, then she drank on the job. Because there is no door number 3 when we look at this. And that became important to me for many reasons. One was that she was a random test. It suggested to me that her supervision didn't see anything, or maybe didn't say anything. It also suggested that her coworkers didn't see, or more likely didn't say anything. And that really concerns me. And this came back to earlier discussion about random. I'm much more comfortable when a supervisor identifies a problem, addresses it, because you cannot believe that she came in at an 09 or higher without having done it many times before. And you have to assume that she's been seen. And that was a very significant issue for us.
Patrick, we've spent a good deal of time talking about alcohol, and I think you've illuminated a number of points for us. But what are some of the other drugs that people are likely to be tested for?
Okay, again, we're going to test for marijuana. We'll test for cocaine, amphetamines, opiates, and PCP.
Now, let me come back to the first one for just a minute, because we've read a lot these days. Medical marijuana is in the news a lot these days. Lots of people say benign drug, medical marijuana, two separate things, and so why is it a big deal?
Well, a couple of issues you bring up. The first one, the issue of being benign. The issue for us is whether or not it impairs. I read an editorial in a local newspaper not too long ago where the author was suggesting that marijuana should be made legal because it doesn't impair. And that's just on the surface false. We know marijuana impairs. If it didn't impair, they wouldn't smoke it so much. It does have an impairing effect. It's like the alcohol in liquor. It does impair. It impairs in some key areas. It impairs in things like depth perception, time awareness, things like reaction time, memory. There are a number of areas that we can really identify the impairment. Now, if somebody wants to make a case that it is relative to other drugs not as significant, they can make that case. Or if they want to make the case that, like alcohol, they want it to be made legal, that's okay with me too. But to say it should be made legal because it doesn't impair is just on the surface false. But the more important question you bring up is this whole issue of medical marijuana. And it is something that we will be addressing here for years to come. And there are a number of issues. The first and foremost is whether or not an employee can come to work if they're smoking medical marijuana. That's a huge issue. And there's multiple answers to that. The first answer is it depends. We know that if an employee falls under the Department of Transportation guidelines, marijuana is not a legally acceptable substance on the federal classification of drugs.
No matter what?
No matter what. Smokable. Now, there is the pill form, Marinol, Dronabinol, but in fact we can actually test, and it will test differently than the smokable form.
Okay.
Smokable marijuana is not legally acceptable on the federal guidelines, and therefore, where a person may in fact take medical marijuana for a legitimate medical issue, and there is an abundance of evidence, a growing body of evidence, that suggests that marijuana probably does have some legitimate medical uses. I have to assume that it's going to continue to grow and become prevalent in our society. But if they have a commercial license and they smoke marijuana, whether it's prescribed by physician or not, or more accurate, recommended, they can't prescribe it yet, but recommended by physician, they're making a career decision. They will lose their job if they test positive. So now back to your question. Can somebody legally smoke marijuana in the state of California? Yes. Can somebody smoke marijuana and perform safety-sensitive functions as defined by the Department of Transportation? The answer is no. So let's get back to medical marijuana for the non-DOT individual. And there's a lot of folks like that on our campuses. Can they smoke marijuana? Well, it gets back to, probably one of our favorite answers. It depends. It depends on whether or not they were impaired. If they can provide medical marijuana so that it provides the desired medical treatment at a level that does not impair the user, it's going to fall under the same kind of considerations that we do for other medications. I'm a big fan of medication. I believe that people need to take the meds that are appropriate for their conditions. Take what you need to fix what's ailing you. Having said that, if the prescribed dose, the therapeutic dose, is above the impairing level, they cannot come to work and do what we do for a living. If it's below that therapeutic level, then it probably is going to be an acceptable substance. One of the challenges we have is we don't know what that level is. there's this curve we have that we call the dose effect curve, and it just makes sense. As you increase the dose, as you increase the amount of a substance you take, it's going to have a more significant effect. Now, it kind of tapers off after a while because alcohol is an easy one. From a 0-0 to a 1-0 is much more dramatic than a 2-0 to a 3-0, or maybe just more passed out. But at some level, you look at that curve. If they can figure out what that impairing level is, then we'll have a better position to discuss whether or not it's acceptable. As it is now, we don't really know what that is. It varies by person, it varies by the quality and the quantity of the substance. So what it really does is it relies not then on the physicians or even the employee, it relies on the supervisor's ability to decide or determine whether they're impaired, just as we have it now for other prescribed meds. For example, we know that the antidepressants, for the most part, have warnings on the label. Most of our anti-anxiety medications have warnings on the label. Most of our pain medications have warnings on the label. We still tell our employees, you can take your medication unless the dose that you're taking causes you to be impaired. And that really is going to be the challenge. So it's a huge issue for us. It will only grow as it appears marijuana is getting more and more acceptance. The issue for us in the workplace is not, again, is it legal or illegal, prescribed or not. The issue is whether or not the employee is impaired. And if they're impaired, they can't come into our school campuses doing what y'all do for a living and be impaired. Now, we may, again, engage in those interactive discussions. We may have some alternative opportunities. But we are going to focus on whether or not they're impaired. And the good news is that's what a supervisor does. Now, if we look at marijuana, that'll be a big issue. You asked the other drugs we're looking for. Cocaine has been a drug that has knocked us for a loop. I mean, it's been around for quite a long time. And I think one of the things we need to really do is understand that cocaine use appears to be actually dramatically decreasing from the peaks back in the 90s. But cocaine as a stimulant still is an issue in many of our communities. And we know that this use has caused us just unfolding difficulties. All we have to do is look at the press nowadays to see some of these drug wars going on. And a lot of it is funded by the extraordinary amounts of money that were generated from the cocaine trade. So cocaine really is an ongoing big issue for us.
Now, you hear a lot about crack on the news. You see it on cops. What exactly is crack? Why is it so powerful? Why is it such a problem? Crack
really was a turning point in our drug history, if you will, here in this country. What happened was back in the 70s, and actually earlier, but in the 70s it really started flourishing, that the drug users started to understand that routes of administration had an impact on intensity of high. The more effective ways of getting the drug in, typically the higher. Nothing is as effective as smoking it. Not snorting it, not shooting it. The most effective way to get a drug in the body is not really to smoke it, by the way, that's a misnomer, is to inhale it. All matter has three states, solid, liquid, and vapor. You heat a solid up enough, it turns into a liquid. You continue to heat it, it's vaporized. When they learned that you could vaporize drugs, and we saw that with heroin in Vietnam era, we saw that with some other substances, that already what happens is the molecules are separated out, rapidly absorbed into the bloodstream, rapidly crosses the blood-brain barrier, impairs more dramatically. So, trying to take the lessons learned from heroin and apply it to cocaine, cocaine wasn't easily smoked back in the early 80s. Cocaine, as it comes across the border, as it's produced typically in South America, comes as cocaine hydrochloride, very acidic. They use muriatic or hydrochloric acid in the final cleaning stages, if you will. It comes up as cocaine hydrochloride. Well, they figured out how to neutralize an acid. It's basic high school chemistry. You have an acid, you add a base, you make a salt. Not necessarily table salt, but a chemical salt, which in this case was very easily vaporized. So the easiest way to make rock cocaine then, or to neutralize the acidic aspects of cocaine, was to add baking soda. And the recipe's on the internet. You can look it up and then actually tell you what proportions to mix them together. So they'd mix cocaine and baking soda together in a blender, pour it out in a little bit of water to make a moisture and to make it a solution, pour it into a cookie sheet. As it dried, it made cracking sounds. Or after it was dried, they cut it into little pieces and they called those rocks. So rock is crack, is cocaine. It's not a different kind of cocaine. It's just a much more easily vaporized cocaine. And it threw us for a loop. Y'all remember the 80s. It was unbelievable into the 90s. In fact, many parts of our communities haven't recovered. What would happen then is that the high was so intense, but short-acting, because there's an inverse relationship between intensity and duration. Very, very intense, short duration. So when they were snorting cocaine, maybe 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how they used it, shooting it. But if they're smoking it, 10, 15 minutes, but extremely impactful. It would flood the midbrain, the pleasure center, with a substance called serotonin. It's the feel-good drug in your brain. And it would have that reinforcing effect, that euphoric effect. So they hit the pipe over and over again. I remember talking to folks, and especially supervisors and managers back in the 80s, that had employees that would say, well, I'll be right back, I got to go to the bathroom. And they didn't come back for 2 days because they're hitting the pipe every 15, 20 minutes. And they're going, oh my gosh, I got to get back to work. But after another hit, there's that reinforcing aspect to it. So crack really was that smokable, vaporized form of cocaine, and it beat us up. Now, the good news about cocaine is cocaine use has dropped dramatically. We're not at the levels we were up into the 90s, and thank God, it was unbelievable. We still see a lot of cocaine out there, but unfortunately, what's probably taken its place are some of the amphetamines, and we test for amphetamines, and there's a number of amphetamines we test for. The benzodrine, dexedrine, biphetamine sulfate, methamphetamine, disoxin. We test for a number of amphetamines.
Patrick, I hear about methamphetamine problems on the news often. Why is that such a big problem these days?
Well, meth, like cocaine, is a stimulant, but it does a couple of things that are fundamentally different from cocaine. Instead of flooding the midbrain, the pleasure center, what it really does is stimulates the limbic system, which governs things like aggression. And so now we start to see people feel powerful, they feel aggressive, and we start to see the violence associated with meth use. The other issue is that while cocaine may last, if you smoke it, 15 minutes, if you snort it or shoot it 45 to an hour, what we're seeing with methamphetamine is, depending on how you use it, smoking it, still a couple of hours. And if you're snorting it or shooting it intravenously, 4 hours, sometimes longer. So now what happens is the folks can come to work. They can use, and they're in our environments, and they're aggressive, and they're hostile. It's cheap to make, it's easy to obtain, and it's rampant. Now, speaking to a number of educators, this is something I think is a huge issue. We also look at how it's starting to affect our kids, and where are people using it. If we go back and look at average age of first use, the average child that drinks, which is most, kids will at least experiment with alcohol, start typically around 12, 13 years of age. Typically by 8th grade, 50% of our kids have had alcohol at least once. Marijuana typically starts a couple years later. We're looking at 9th, 10th grade, right around 14 years of age, they're starting to smoke marijuana. Cocaine, they didn't start using until they're in the early 20s. Why do you think that is? Why do you think not until their 20s?
Too expensive.
Yeah,
It's expensive. It costs them money. Even though it's $5 rock, if you're doing one every 7 minutes, it was expensive. So typically they had to wait till they got a job. Meth, on the other hand, we're seeing them use it as early as they did marijuana, and in many cases earlier. And there's some other huge issues with methamphetamine. Besides the stimulating qualities, the aggressive aspect of it, it does release a lot of a brain chemical called acetylcholine, which is highly correlated with schizophrenia. It not only makes them mean, but it makes them crazy mean. And you read the articles and you scratch your head saying, what were they thinking? It's that overwhelming aggression, that very significant hostility, the almost crazy type of behavior that's shocking. And then the other pieces they're starting earlier. We are at a crossroads. We're not really sure how to successfully treat methamphetamine as well as we can some other drugs. I mean, there's some extraordinary research going on. There's some very talented people working on it. But when you look at the early first stage of use, when you look at the cognitive issues, when you look at the physiological impact, kids go through these spurts of cognitive development, emotional development. Some of them never get through them, but throughout their lifespan. With the meth use at the early age, they're missing them. And so what ends up happening is they become young adults that really haven't mastered certain cognitive processes. They haven't mastered emotional stability issues. And they may not be using in their 20s and 30s, but they're still not able to function in a healthy, rational way. So meth is devastating our communities. And the meth production is peaking again. We know again, up until the late 90s, it was a major issue. There was some interdiction efforts, there were some education efforts, and we saw a drop for a few years, but we're seeing it slowly gather steam again. And among the kids is the part that worries us. So meth is it's whipping us out there.
You mentioned opiates as well. Let's go on to that for just a second, because I think we've all heard about opiates in the past and are more familiar with them.
Well, you know, we have a number of opiates. Heroin's a big daddy. That's the one we hear about. Heroin's not as much of an issue. It's still out there. There was an interesting study done recently that there's a major East Coast city where they estimate that 1 out of every 10 citizens of that city use heroin. And it's a large port city, and it's remarkable. But what I think we really are seeing, if we look at the opiates, are the other pain medications. That's what opiates are. They're pain pills. And it's the pill form. We're seeing Vicodin, codeine. We remember the old codeine mills, and so the government was able to start to crack down on that, and they moved to Vicodin. And now they're moving to OxyContin. Huge issues in today's newspaper, and we know it's going to be in next week's newspaper and next year's, where we're starting to see OxyContin use. We've seen it among some very high visibility folks, where they'll say that they were taking it for medical purposes and became addicted, and there's some real mixed research on whether that's honest or not. But we have no doubt that folks are taking OxyContin. And OxyContin really is a powerful pain medication. There's a task force that is doing some great work. It's a DEA, Department of Justice, there's Highway Patrol, and some other local law enforcement agencies are working down in San Diego, and they're starting to see a lot of kids smoking OxyContin. And what they're finding is that it's having a huge impact again. Gets in quickly, more likely to overdose because they're not able to quantify and control the dose. So we're seeing the pills really take off. Harder to get than they were 5 years ago, but still very easy. I read something just the other day. Betty Ford Clinic puts out a newsletter, and they cited a study suggesting that 40% of high school seniors have used OxyContin in this country. That's remarkable. I'd like to believe that that's just wrong. But maybe it's 20%. That's still huge. That's a big chunk. So the opiates are out there in large numbers: cocaine, methamphetamine, marijuana, and then we have, of course, PCP. That's an extraordinary drug.
You know, and tell me something about PCP. Again, it's something you hear about on the news, don't know much about it. I've even heard they tranquilize animals with PCP.
Well, PCP started off as a surgical anesthetic, and it really was going to be this miracle drug, because what it did, instead of decreasing your vitals when you were under, as most anesthesias do, it actually elevated the vitals. Unfortunately, people had what they called unacceptable side effects, like waking up during surgery, you know, assisting, but also the hallucinations and other kinds of bizarre experiences. So they did, in fact, then start to use it instead for animals. For humans, it's called Cernal. For animals, Cernal-An. It is still used. There's a form of PCP out there. We actually don't see PCP very much out there. There's enough other drugs out there that are more easy to get. We see a lot more ecstasy, for example, which is MDMA, and it's a methamphetamine-based derived substance. So we don't see PCP as much as we did in the old days. However, there's the similar substance, ketamine, which is still used in both surgical procedures for humans, but is used for major animal tranquilizing. And so we will sometimes see kids will go in, or other adults, and they'll divert it or they'll steal it and they'll use it in that way. But I'll be honest with you, PCP is very, very rare compared to meth, compared to ecstasy, compared to the opiates. We don't see it, but it's still out there. So we will test for those other 5 substances in addition to alcohol.
We've been talking about the most common drugs of abuse and how each of them may affect the user, as we've talked about in a workplace situation. Are there some general principles, I guess we could talk about, that a supervisor should be aware of to help him or her be aware of how those drugs are affecting the user?
Well, the broad categories. We all know alcohol is fundamentally different than cocaine, which is fundamentally different from OxyContin, which again is different from PCP. But really what all the drugs of abuse do is they affect key areas. They affect the person's mood, the affect. If you were to ask me, one of the most significant indicators of drug use, I would start saying looking at their attitude. It's a huge issue. Are they overreactive? Are they belligerent? It's just those kind of affective issues, their mood. So a key overriding issue is, regardless of the differences between the drugs, we look at the impact on their mood. The mood swings, the unpredictability, the overreacting to what may be perceived as criticism or other kinds of events that come up during the day. Another key area that, again, I think is a general impact on the user that is very consistent across the drugs is the impact on their thinking. the ability to process information, to retain, to remember. If you go back and look at some of the basic standardized field sobriety tasks that police officers ask people to do, it's not just walk a line, but walk a certain number of steps. You know, turn around. It's to remember the instructions they were given. We ask our employees to do much more complex things, and we have to pay attention to their ability to process, retain, and cognitively maintain the healthy state. So we pay attention to the mood, their ability to think, and how they process information. Again, we look at behavior. Action talks. We were taught that when we were children. We pay attention to how they conduct themselves. And for me, it gets back to that safe, effective, appropriate. We look at their relationships. What we often will find is maybe their coworkers might not turn them in or report it, but we don't like being around that. I remember when we first started doing a lot of this work in drug testing in the workplace, I remember a lot of the union reps were very leery, and a lot of them felt that, wait, this is an invasive tool and this is inappropriate. I do training throughout the state now, and I have the same reps who were yelling and upset with me 10 years ago saying, the big problem now is they're not doing it because it's the coworkers, it's the other members who are paying a huge price for this. And you'll start to see relationships sever in the workplace. They'll start to hang out with other non-performing substance abusing employees. And then we look at even basic issues like health and hygiene. One of the more remarkable calls I had was many years ago. I got a call from a supervisor, and as a female supervisor called me one day and said, I got a problem. I have this employee, and I don't know how to say it now, she stinks. Bad breath, bad body odor. She hasn't changed her clothes in several days, same dirty clothes. She's a mess. She hasn't done much work lately. She's walking around argumentative, getting into it with everybody. And right now she's sitting at her desk arguing out loud with Jesus. And while we're on the phone, she goes, oh my, now she's crawling under her desk, covering herself up with newspapers. Do you think we have a problem? Well, I'm a consultant, so the answer is, I don't know. You better fly me up there, right? That's a 3-day question. But I said, of course you've got a problem. She said, what drug do you think it is? Now, I was much younger and more naive, and I'm thinking, well, you've got this gross lack of self-care. What may, as we investigate more carefully, turn out to be hallucinations, delusions, this very bizarre thinking. I said, I think you've got a medical emergency. I think you've got a psychiatric issue. Here's a 40-year-old individual, a single parent, 20 years with the company. This can't be drugs. Of course, it turned out when they did not only get a psych eval, but they did drug test her given her job. It was methamphetamine-induced psychosis. So it taught me, let's look for the drugs, let's pay attention to what we see, and we look at folks. We notice health, hygiene, behavior, relationships. We see these things.
So let me follow up and say, that's the impact on the user.
Sure.
Given those sets of circumstances, what's the impact on the workplace?
Well, when that person comes into the workplace, we're going to have a situation, at the very least, where we require excessive supervision. It is going to draw the supervisor's time and energies to clean up, to fix, to address, to respond to this behavior. We see clearly absenteeism. There's all kinds of studies out there that the substance abusing employee has much more absenteeism than the non-substance abusing. They have more accidents and injuries reportable, and maybe sometimes they won't report them initially, and that's always of interest to me when they report it several days later. They're not observed. They have a lot more issues that relates to quality of work, quantity of work, lowered productivity. They affect overall morale, because other folks are tired of the issues. And what's really striking to me is that the coworkers will often come to supervision and say, you got to do something about this employee. Now, I'm not saying what I think is going on, but you've got to fix it. We even see the relationship to violence, to workers' comp claims, health care costs overall. I mean, the impact is rather dramatic in just an abundance of areas.
Pat, I hear you mention a relationship between substance abuse and violence in the workplace. How do you see that?
For the last, actually 15 years, I've spent a lot of time on threat assessment, the prevention of workplace violence, and if we were to go back and look at just at my caseload, and in our practice we've had over 1,000 cases in the last 15 years, we looked at every case, my partner and I, and what we identified was probably 55 to 60% of the cases were violent, were drug cases. They were called in as violence. The person was acting belligerent. They were scaring folks. But had they addressed the behavior earlier, had they drug tested them, they never would have gotten to the point of having to call in someone because they're afraid of them. And so we've been talking to other professionals in the area. We're seeing, at least at the lower grades, now when you get to workplace homicide, it's a very different psychological process. But at the low grades, what we see, threats, hostility, belligerence, the bullying, the fighting, that's almost overwhelmingly substance-related. So we're going to start looking at how having an effective substance use policy is really a violence prevention policy. We're going to find an effective substance use policy may in fact be a very effective harassment and discrimination policy as well, that these things really do work well together, and they intertwine.
Now, Patrick, is drug testing the only available option for employees to address this problem?
It's not the only. And sometimes it may not be the appropriate. But what this supervisor has to do, and in fact the campus and the faculty and the administration together will try to identify a problem area and look at what is the most effective tool to address it. I truly believe that drug testing should be on the table often and early. Where is appropriate, let's drug test. If it's a positive test, it gives us a host of information. If it's negative, we still have administrative remedies to address these. It's not acceptable, even if it's not drug-related, to have attendance problems, to have attitude issues, to have belligerence, to be intimidating, to engage in unsafe behavior. So I think what we want to do is look at drug testing as just an idea or a tool to help us decide where else do we go. But ultimately, it's going to be an administrative remedy. And we do have the opportunity to address these behaviors. What we find is often folks will let them go and not address them, and in hope that the drug test will catch it. It may not. But we want to look at drug testing as just another tool in that host of tools that supervisors have to keep this a safe, healthy work environment.
Great, thank you.
Well, people often suggest that what we should be most concerned about is changes in an employee's behavior or job performance. What's your opinion of that?
Well, we hear that, and at some level there's something to be said for that. The issue is, are they changing? The problem that gives me difficulties with that is that there's a presumption of what they were doing was okay. And a lot of times they'll say, well, he's always been a lousy employee. Well, wait a minute, that's not okay. And what they'll say, well, what's normal for him? The issue is, I don't really care what's normal for Marshall. I don't care what's normal for me. I care what's safe, effective, appropriate for this work environment, as defined by the school district, as defined by our policy. And if the behavior is not safe, effective, appropriate, then we need to address it. Now, having said that, we notice change. Something's going on. People are very consistent as we behave. So as a supervisor or manager, I would want you to be attentive. I'd want you to notice the little things. And it may be well before they get to the point that you are going to be in a position to drug test them, you can address their behavior. You can bring in other resources. Change means something, positive or negative. We need to pay attention. So I accept that change is relevant. I'm not willing to say that we need to therefore hold somebody to a standard for what's normal for them. Because I don't care what's normal for them. I care about what the company decides.
Let me ask you a question that some people might say is fairly obvious. If substance abuse is prevalent in many of our workplaces, why don't we see it more easily?
Well, unfortunately, there's a couple of things that come together that I don't know about hide it, but make it harder to address, perhaps. One is that it's not as if somebody uses a drug and the world falls apart. There's what we call a progression of impact. And for some folks, their world falls apart fairly quickly. We'll start to see the attendance, the behavior very quickly. For some, it can take years. And if we put on top of that progression, that often what will happen is when somebody comes on board, they get a reputation during their probationary period or early on in their career. And that reputation often will create a halo effect. So that as they start to demonstrate problems, as they start to have attendance issues, as they start to not perform, people say, well, yeah, but they're a good employee. Remember how well they used to do. And what really ends up happening is that halo effect lags behind. And the progression sometimes gets to a point where they're really not functioning. And finally, we take action. I worked a case a few years ago. It was really heartbreaking is what it was. Well, it was a threat case where there was a firefighter, 30 years of service, has a DUI, a second one pending. There's some issues about whether it'd be actually charged or not. And what ended up happening is the other firefighters in the station would refuse to work with him. They were afraid to come to work. Now, that's a big deal. When firefighters are afraid to work with one of their colleagues, that's a big deal to me. And as we looked into it more carefully, we found out that he had a huge drinking problem, probably other drugs as well. And so now they had a 30-year, severely alcoholic employee. If they'd addressed it a couple of years earlier, I think they would have had a heavy drinking colleague with a lot of problems. If they'd addressed it a couple of years before that, they would have had a person who's starting to develop a drinking problem who had a lot of other problems. If they'd addressed it maybe a couple of years before that, when he first started demonstrating some issues, then they would have had a colleague who had problems that may have been able to get helped. And what ended up happening now is that his captain initially, and then eventually one of his lower chiefs, but his battalion chief, said, no, I know this guy. He's a good guy. Okay, I know he's having problems. I know he's not showing up for work. I know he's getting in these arguments. I know but he's a good guy. I went through the academy with him. And the problem was that halo effect, it didn't protect the employee. He kept getting worse and worse. And at some point in time, we've got to intervene so that we can help some of these folks.
And it seems like somebody has to really hit rock bottom before they can get any help to address their problems and stop their drug use. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, and there's again, you know, there's two sides to that. We know that a person has to get to a point in their life where they really have decided, I can't keep doing this and I want to get help. And there's a lot of work and treatment and intervention, and we see some of those things. But the other piece is, the truth is there's really only one rock bottom. The only true bottom is death. Everything else is relative. Years ago, one of my students was a clinical director of a mission downtown L.A., and he'd asked me to come by and was showing me the work he was doing. And I remember it was right around Christmas season. I'm sitting on the curb with this fella, and we're talking, and he says, look at me, Mr. Prince. He says, I live in a box on the street. I eat garbage out of the gutter. So I put my head at night where you wouldn't want your shoes to go. People urinate, you know, where I sleep at night. Look at my life. It can't get worse. But I got a little voice in the back of my head saying, I bet it can. You know, wait till it starts raining, or somebody steals your box, or mugs. It can always get worse. So the challenge we have is that we wait and let somebody get to the bottom. Most folks will hit a point where they're going to turn around. Most people do get better. That's why we have treatment programs. We all believe in it because it's valuable. But the challenge we have is they may not be able to do it while they have this job, while they have this family, while they have this home. So I think one of the challenges for supervisors is to see the performance issues earlier, to identify the behavioral concerns, and use the tools we have. Drug testing is a valuable one. I think that administrative action, discipline, is another tool. It starts to tell somebody, we've got to get you something. We use EAP. We use a number of resources. But what we can't do is let it go and let it go, waiting for them to hit their own bottom, because, frankly, we lose family members. We lose friends. We lose colleagues. And at a fundamental level, we've got to get on the curve earlier, be more willing to hold people accountable, and I think that we can do that. And it gets back to now your question. Why is it we don't see it? I think we see it, but we don't really want to call it for what it is. We don't want to use those tools we have because we still have a hard time saying, but he's a good guy. Good guys can have big problems. We still need to intervene. And some folks are just bad folks, and those we don't usually have trouble getting rid of, and I don't, I'm saying it sounds mean, but we got some good folks out there that if we don't intervene and we don't see what's right there before us, then I think we own some of what happens to them, and we miss it because of that.
Let me talk about several things. We talked about various drugs of abuse. We talked about the impact on the user and the impact on the workplace. And we've discussed drug testing. So how would a supervisor be able to require an employee to submit to drug testing on the basis of what you've been talking about, that quote-unquote reasonable cause?
Right. Well, we need to go back and look at how reasonable cause is defined and look at how a supervisor can observe, can document, can articulate their observations, and then move forward with the existing policies that the company or the school district has in place. First of all, I want to define reasonable cause, and there's a definition that I found very useful that comes actually from the state of California. Back in the 1980s, the state was directed to put together drug testing, and they wrote a policy that I've loved ever since then. Under Department of Personnel Administration guidelines in the state of California, reasonable cause is a good faith belief based on articulable facts or evidence that an employee has violated the state's policy, and drug testing may reveal additional evidence related to that violation. What it really does is it puts it into context. It's not a finding of fact. It's a belief. It's a good faith belief. It's a belief the supervisor has. This person may be in violation of our policy. It says you will not come to work impaired. You will not perform these duties. And drug testing then is just an opportunity to get additional evidence related to that potential violation. That's nice. It puts it into a context. More specifically then, if we go back and look at the Department of Transportation regulations, they go on to say that these observations must be based on specific, contemporaneous, articulable observations regarding the appearance, behavior, speech, or body odors of the driver.
So let me ask you to enumerate a little bit on each of those, because I guess we need some definitions on what to look for.
Great. So what a supervisor will do is will supervise as they naturally would. They pay attention to the behavior of all employees. They make themselves present. They assess the environment around the employees. And they look at these major areas, and they document when they see or have information that would give them to understand that there's something wrong. Appearance, behavior, speech, or body odors. Appearance can be like the case I mentioned earlier, where the person is disheveled. They're not showing good self-care. The fact that someone's not showing good self-care doesn't necessarily mean drugs. But kind of like when you mentioned earlier, changes. Something's going on. We need to pay attention to how they appear, what they present. Is it appropriate? I used to load trucks. I was a casual laborer in a Teamster shop back in the 1970s. I didn't wash my clothes very often because we were loading trucks. But I cleaned me between shifts. And so we start to notice whether somebody's doing that. But really, from my view, appearance also includes the eyes. Because we've all grown up, the eyes are the window
to the soul.
No, we don't talk about spiritual stuff at the school district. But they certainly are the eye, the window to the body.
Just quoting the old...
Well, and by the way, they may be as well. but certainly the window to the body. We look at people's eyes, and there are some extraordinary pieces of information. As a parent, as a supervisor, or manager, as a member of society, the simplest things to look at are things like pupil size. We know from the research and just common experience that there's a fairly predictable range of pupil size. Now, it happens to be 3.0 to 6.5 millimeters, which in and of itself may not mean very much. But if the average iris is 12 millimeters, as the light goes down, your pupil goes up to about half or a little larger than half. In brighter lights, the pupil comes down to about a quarter to a third the total diameter. When the pupil is enlarged to such an extent that it's much larger than half the total diameter of the iris, that's significant. We're going to say to ourselves, something's going on. We notice that. It's actually a basic human reflex to notice eyes and respond because it lets us know if there's danger. So we have dilated pupils. That's related to things like cocaine, amphetamine, all the stimulants. In fact, marijuana, given the dose and the purity of the marijuana, probably dilates pupils. So we look for that. Now, somebody asked a question earlier about other things. We know that other issues can cause dilated pupils. Things like fear, excitement. Well, part of what a supervisor does, as I mentioned, they don't just look at an individual. They look at an individual within a context. If I have an employee who's been involved in an accident, let's say an injury-involved accident, supervision rolls out to the scene, they try to ascertain what's going on, I would expect my employee to be agitated, to have dilated pupils, to be talking, to be perspiring, to be upset. I would expect that. By the way, that sounds like stimulants. So what do? We change the environment. We ask our employee, come here, let's talk over here, let's get away from the noise. If after a few minutes their body doesn't come back into that appropriate range, their pupils are still dilated, they're still talking a mile a minute, then I start to wonder if there's not something else contributing. So I don't just look at an employee, but look at an employee within a context. What else is going on? And we look at the eyes. Now, the other end of the extreme would be constricted pupils. There are very few things that constrict pupils. Opiates are number 1 and probably 2, 3, 4, 5 on the list. If somebody's taking enough of Vicodin, OxyContin, heroin, it will constrict the pupils. But I also know, for example, that pesticide poisoning often will demonstrate in constricted pupils. So once again, the supervisor is not just looking at the individual, but they're looking at what else is going on around them to put that all together to come to a reasonable course of action. Pupil size is enormous. Now, another big, I think, key indicator in the eyes, and we've all watched TV, we've all seen cops where they do stuff with the checkpoints. They're looking for a condition called nystagmus. It's an involuntary bouncing of the eyes as it moves on a horizontal plane, or they call it vertical nystagmus, going up and down. Well, we know a lot of folks, maybe half, have what we call endpoint nystagmus. There's some visible bouncing at endpoint. But when it starts to bounce in much earlier, it's significant. And as we talk to people, if their eyes are bouncing, if we get that it's like a little vibration, you can see it. That's significant. It may be they have an elevated alcohol level, because alcohol will cause nystagmus. Some of the other depressants. On the other hand, we know certain other conditions, multiple sclerosis when they're symptomatic, albinism, post-rotational, you spin somebody around. So again, you have to look at the environment, what's been going on. So I'm not saying if you see something in the eyes, it automatically means drugs, but I'm telling you, if you see something in the eyes, you better respond. And then maybe the most important eye sign of all, and there's some debate about this, but you notice one pupil's dilated and one's within the normal range. And of course, that's consistent with
medical brain injury.
That's a medical injury. That's a concussion. You see that on TV when the EMTs arrive on scene. You see that when the football coach grabs the player's helmet and they're looking, they're checking to see are the pupils equal size. And when they're greater than 1 millimeter different, that's important. It is a key indicator of a concussion. As we get older, every morning I brush my teeth, I look in the mirror, see how I'm doing. Because I also know that sometimes a week before symptoms appear, if you're having a stroke, you can see one pupil dilate out, even before the paralysis, the loss of speech, the cognitive deficits. So I guess it's a rhetorical question. Aren't we just as interested in identifying the employee in the middle of a medical emergency as we are under the influence of drugs? And this is of course. So we look at things, when we talk about appearance, I look at the eyes. We look at a person's face, flushed, perspiring. That's a key issue for not just drugs when they're taking a drug which elevates their vitals. It's a huge issue when we've got things like heat stroke or heat frustration or shock. Flushed, perspiring, too hot, cold and clammy or too cold. We look at people and we gather information about their appearance. And I don't expect the supervisor to be an EMT. I don't expect the supervisor to be a licensed physician. I expect the supervisor to be able to observe what's going on with the employees in their environment and to capture it, to document it. And we're finding that many districts now are creating sheets that allow supervisors to capture their observations, and they categorize them: appearance, behavior, speech, body odors. Behavior we've been talking about. The behavior that's most significant to me is what's appropriate for this workplace, what's safe, what's effective. Not showing up for work, disappearing from the job, the attitude, conflict issues, those are behaviors that are significant and you have to address in the workplace. Speech, of course, they're referring to things like slurred speech, but it also means inappropriate tone, inappropriate language. If somebody's screaming and yelling and your supervisor said, you need to calm down, sit down and let's talk about this civilly, and they cannot contain themselves in their language, I don't know what that means necessarily, but it is very important and worth looking into more carefully. And certainly a drug test might be a tool to help you look into it. So we pay attention to speech, incomplete sentences, trailing off, those kind of things. And then the one that always gets everybody laughing, of course, is body odors. And we're not talking about BO, although certainly that's an indication that maybe there's lack of self-care. But of course, the key odor that we're looking for or paying attention to is odor of alcoholic beverage. Now, a question that often comes up, let's say you as a supervisor detect or believe that you smell an odor of alcoholic beverage upon your employee. Is that in and of itself enough to get somebody tested? Well, there's some discussion out there. My answer would be yes. I don't want you by your nose trying to decide, well, is that person an 04 or an 08? Sure. Now, what I hear supervisors more often say is, well, I would supervise more closely. I respect that, but I would use caution because when they know that you're observing, they're going to clean up their act. They're going to try to not allow you to see things. So there are some real judgment calls. Back to where we first started off. It is subjective. It is judgment. But I want the supervisors to pay attention. We pay attention to other odors. The odor of marijuana. In this day and age, everybody, my children know what marijuana smells like. We're at a concert. My son, who's now 16, was 9. He said, Dad, what's that smell? I said, people are smoking marijuana. He said, oh, they need to be arrested. And I said, no, it's just a ticket, and he lost faith in the criminal justice system. But at a level, we notice these things. The challenge for us as supervisors is to be willing to capture our observations, to document them, and to use those tools that we have available to us. And in my opinion, drug testing is an incredibly valuable tool, that we pick it off the table, apply it in a meaningful way. And when we use drug testing for cause more effectively, it reduces the host of other issues we have. I would suggest a majority of adverse action ultimately is going to be substance related. Typically we take adverse action, attendance, theft, well, those are the big ones. But there's some other ones related to that, accidents. But I suspect in the vast majority of those cases, there's still a substance issue underlying. And if we'd addressed it earlier, we may have helped save that person's, not just their life, but maybe their careers. So I really look at the supervisor's ability to identify, their willingness to confront, their ability to apply our policies is instrumental in creating that safe, healthy, effective work environment, the drug-free workplace.
Patrick, thank you very much. This has been an illuminating discussion.
Okay.
We want
Thank
to
you.
say we appreciate your time. I want to thank the panel as well for some very thoughtful and insightful questions. It's been, as I said, very informational and something that I think we can all take away and utilize in the workplace in an effective manner.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
And we want to thank you for joining us. It's been, as we said, interesting, illuminating, and we hope that you've learned something from what we've talked about today. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you.